Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Bottom Line. I'm your host, Lauren Kalil. Our show is brought to you by Whoop. Start tracking your strain, recovery, and sleep scores with Whoop, and even get an extra month's membership and a free 4.0 strap when you sign up with the link in our description. If you like listening to us chat about CrossFit news and everything that's going on in the sport, make sure to like and subscribe to our channel. We have a bit of breaking news today. On the show, we're having Brian Friend. He recently wrote an article on Morning Chalk Up about a shift in the semifinals, where people are going. Now, one of the biggest names who was going to the Atlas Games originally, Mal O'Brien, is now seated to go to the Granite Games. Brian, let's just start with an overlay. What is happening here?
Yeah, so following the individual quarterfinals, CrossFit sent a survey out to athletes that, per our understanding, was asking about if there are any travel restrictions or limitations for athletes in continents that have multiple semifinals. So that would only be in North America and Europe, where there's a seeding process, but it's unclear as to what that is. And so the assumption would be that based on the responses to that survey, CrossFit would factor that into their seeding process. However, over the last couple of weeks, there'd been some rumblings in the background that several athletes who had gotten that survey responded to that survey and said that there would be problems with their travel, specifically to Canada, were seated in the Atlas Games anyway. As we've kind of been tracking the backfilling process internationally, and we noticed that there haven't been any backfill sent out to athletes in the United States, one of the kind of speculations was, well, maybe they're trying to correct that, to figure it out and make sure that the athletes that they've placed in Atlas Games can actually get there. And it appears that that is a process that's been ongoing, and that in the last 24 hours or less, we've seen some of the fallout of that on the leaderboards on CrossFit's Games website. So if you looked yesterday at this time, you would have seen Mal O'Brien and a couple others seated at the Atlas Games, and now you'll see them seated at different semifinals. At the top of the list here is two athletes, Nadia Falmer and Mallory O'Brien, who yesterday were scheduled for Atlas Games, today are now in the Granite Games. And then on the men's side, there are also three athletes, all of whom were previously seeded for Atlas Games and have been moved to either the MACC or the Granite Games. The details about why each of them was moved are potentially different, and we're not exactly sure. But what we do know is that they were all moved sometime in the past 24 hours.
When we look at your article, you wrote a piece this morning, but it was recently updated. We got a quote from CrossFit, the head of communication and public policy of CrossFit, Andrew Weinstein. He says, while we cannot accommodate requests based on personal preferences for a particular semifinal, our goal is to allow as many qualifying athletes as possible to compete at each stage of the season. So we are trying to make accommodations for qualifying athletes who face visa issues based on vaccination status or other factors to help them move to another semifinal on the same continent if available, or the last chance qualifier in some cases if not. What exactly is he saying here, especially with the athletes that you've talked to so far? I feel like they're all dealing with the same issue, and some athletes were able to change their semifinal and others are still stuck.
Yeah. So the article points out the athletes that did get basically their request accommodated and were able to be reseeded into a semifinal that they'd be able to travel to much more easily. Whether they got this request approved or for the athletes that did not, there's most likely one and or two things that were preventing them from traveling there. Is either a lack of a vaccine or a lack of a passport, and in some cases, maybe a lack of both of those things. So we're trying to see if there's a pattern. If they're allowing athletes who don't have vaccine to be moved, but they're trying to force athletes who don't have a passport to get one quickly and still want them to compete there. Ultimately, what the real problem for CrossFit is here is that they're going to have a hard time rounding out that Atlas Games field to 30, because on the men's side, now that they've made these moves, the other three United States semifinals are full, and there's 7 available spots in Atlas Games, and a couple of those spots are still outstanding for athletes who got an original invitation and have been pleading to try to get a switch, and CrossFit's giving them an extended deadline now, but they have still said that you have to go to the Atlas Games, and I don't know if those athletes will be able to make it to the Atlas Games or not. So it's a really tough. It's becoming a tough situation for CrossFit, and that's where I think that little piece at the end about If not, the last chance qualifier could be an option. So we get a little bit of a hint here of something that's not confirmed at all, that maybe in the case of an athlete who hasn't been reseeded but won't be able to get to Atlas Games, they might say, okay, well, your semifinal is now the last chance qualifier, and that's your path to the games if you want to pursue it.
Which obviously changes things because at these semifinals, there's way more, or at least a handful more of qualifying positions. Once you get to the last chance qualifier, I mean, those are all of the people that were right on the cusp that you're competing against. So I guess I don't know how fair that is.
I mean, it's certainly not as appealing of an option of having a semifinal to begin with, because at least in that stage, if you don't make it, then there's a last chance qualifier as a secondary stage. But yeah, like you said, if you just are, if the circumstances unfold and you're an athlete who qualified in the top 120 in North America, and for whatever reason you end up being sent directly to last chance qualifier, now you're competing against, 30 other guys at least who were on the door of making the games to begin with. Yes, that's an extremely competitive field and not a very likely path to the games for someone in that situation.
Let's look again at the athletes, and you broke down their ranking to try to make sense of how people were seated in each one and who decided, who is going to be reseated. Kind of explain this section with the athletes and their ranking and what we're looking at now at the Atlas Games versus the Granite Games.
Yeah, so when the initial seedings came out, I did kind of a first takes, big picture look at the seedings. And in North America, one of the things I noticed was that the top four seeds for both the men and the women were split between the four semifinals. So at the very least, you had the four best performers from the quarterfinals being distributed evenly across those four fields. Taking Mallory O'Brien out of the Granite Games or out of Atlas Games and moving her to Granite Games now pairs her with Amanda Barnhart, who was the 4 seed after quarterfinals. So you have the 1 and the 4 seed in the same semifinal. And then if you just look at some of the other athletes that are in that field, you have Emily Rolfe, 2 times games finisher, both or qualifier, both times in the top 20. You have Danny Spiegel, 3 times games qualifier. Yes, she had to withdraw last year. The previous year, she was 13th. And in the 2019 cut year, 26th. And then you finally have Fee Sagafi, who also made it down to, Fee and Danny in 2019, they're getting cut at the same times as Sarah Sigmundsdottir is. Like Brent Fikowski got cut then. Like we don't know what their actual potential was for that season at the games. But if you compare that to the remaining women at the Atlas Games, of which there are only 3 previous games qualifiers, we see Erin Vandendreich, who was 50th in 2019, which is, worse than the relative other ones in the Atlas Games. We see Caroline Connors, who had a near bottom of the pack finish last year and 33rd. That's a little bit skewed because I think there were 5 or 6 women that withdrew from the competition altogether. So while she made the games last year out of the Granite Games, it wasn't a great finish at the games. And then you have Caroline Prevost, who's had a pretty good finish in 2019 and kind of an average or below average finish for her last year. And it just looking at the numbers on paper there, it's pretty obvious to everyone that the Granite Games women's field is going to be pretty tough to crack into that top 5. Whereas in the Atlas Games, there's a lot of opportunity here and for the athletes that are there. But if you're trying to think about the big picture, which is to get the best and most competitive field at the games, it's tough to make the argument based on history, at least, that the Atlas Games is going to produce a similarly, competitive field to the other North American women's semifinal fields.
When we're looking at the Atlas Games, it seems like for the past 3 years, they have just been dealt a tough hand. Canceled due to COVID. Last year, it had to be virtual. Then this year, they have one of the biggest names in the sport who more than likely is going to take a podium spot. They post it on social media. Here's the post that you linked in the article, the Instagram page. I mean, 479 likes. People were saying that they're excited to buy tickets. They can't wait to go see Mal at this semifinal. What does it do for the Atlas Games, taking her away from that competition?
Yeah, I mean, it's really brutal, and to me, this is like a kind of the worst part of this whole situation is they made this post, yesterday afternoon. The response was exceedingly positive. Not only are they people excited that she's coming to compete there, but the likelihood that someone who'd be accompanying her on that trip is Matt Fraser, which is obviously going to be an appeal for people, even if he's not competing, just to see him in the arena and have an opportunity to watch him walk around, or maybe even get an autograph from him or something like that is super exciting to fans in Canada. And then to have that stripped away, not just from the fans, but from the, the competition directors a couple hours later as the reseeding takes place. And it just makes you wonder, like, why wasn't CrossFit not communicating to their own competition ahead of time? Hey, just so you know, there's still some things being in the works. Don't make any, like, you see all these competitions making posts about the marquee athletes that are going to be at their events. You have to assume that Atlas Games is going to do the same with Mallory O'Brien. The
Well,
only
now on the
athlete that,
flip side, I mean, you see that Granite Games has now posted.
yeah, and so then, this is obviously she was competing there last year, so they'll have a great picture of her and whatever, and they're going to be super excited that she's coming. But I would think that this is a good opportunity for the competition directors as a group of colleagues in the sport to unite and say, hey, this isn't right. As much as we're happy to have Mallory here, this is a huge blow to Atlas Games. And I think this is, a little bit of a slap in the face to post this so soon and so excited about it when Atlas Games is reeling from this decision that CrossFit made.
Brian, what is the bottom line with there's so many different things that we can unfold, but looking at this from a 100-foot view, what's your bottom line right now from the facts that we have?
To me, the bottom line is that this is another black mark in the season for the CrossFit Games team. And I don't know exactly what happened that caused this to be the situation, but it's not a good look. It's continuing a line of really unfortunately bad moves that they continue to make. I think, as I wrote in the article, it's positive for Mal and her team. It's a positive for the women at the Atlas Games who now have an extra open spot to the games. But outside of those two things, which really shouldn't matter in the big picture, it's a negative look in every other way for every other entity, and it's disappointing that this is how the season is unfolding right now.
Brian, friend, thank you so much for sitting down and talking to us more about the topic. The article you wrote will continue to update it as more information comes about.